Today's lecture will focus on Chapter 10 of the text, looking at police use of force. Please follow along on your own computer as I will go through the PowerPoint here in this video. In today's lecture, we will be looking at Chapter 10 of the text, Police Use of Force. We will discuss various methods of force used, the reasons why force is used, and the issues associated with police use of force against particular community members. It's important to note first the difference between police brutality and unnecessary force. We have discussed this briefly in previous lectures. The main difference is that police brutality is a willful and knowingly committed act that is intended to commit and basically committed to commit a crime. There is an illicit intent, potentially illicit motives, but the officer intended to commit a crime, which means that they knew what they were doing was wrong and they did it anyway. Unnecessary force just means that more force was used in a situation than hypothetically could have been used to resolve the situation. Typically, police officers will err on the side of using too much force as opposed to not enough, for the main reason of trying to keep people safe in the environment that are innocent or are their other officers or are themselves. As we've discussed previously, the safety of the suspect comes basically fourth in line when we're discussing what a police officer is thinking about a given situation. So to resolve the situation and maintain the safety of the civilians, of their other officers, and of the officer themselves, we typically allow police officers to err on that side of using just a little bit too much force, as long as there's not a malice or malicious intent to the actions that are taking place. The study of this process has teased out what we call split-second syndrome, in that police officers do not have a lot of time to decide what they're going to do on a particular situation. They have to make an immediate decision with threats of danger, potentially deadly force trying to be visited upon them. So we allow them the freedom to make those decisions with limited repercussions compared to how average citizens face repercussions based on their potential violent acts. Which is why, again, I've stressed the importance that civilian arrests are not a good thing to ever try to engage in. Our duty as civilians is to observe and report and maintain our own safety if we are involved in a situation such as this. The scale of force that police officers act on is broken down into several different levels, and we will go over those levels now. Just the mere presence of a police officer in a situation affects people's decision making. People will act differently around police, they will talk differently around police, they may even do things like walk to the other side of the street if they see a police officer on the side of the street where they are. Depending on people's past personal experience with the police, their current activities with the police are directly affected. So an officer just being in a situation has an effect on people's decision making and actions, and thus we put that at the lowest level of force, because that is a known societal interaction. The next level on the force scale is persuasion, which I like to define as the police officers asking for things to happen. A police officer asking someone that is potentially loitering to move along, or asking someone that's engaging in low-level disorderly conduct to refrain from that activity. Uh, a common example, well, not necessarily a common example, in the state of Georgia, an individual can actually be ticketed for swearing in public around women and children. So a police officer asking someone to refrain from that type of behavior, say at a sporting event or in a public setting like a mall, uh, would be engaging in that persuasion, asking someone to stop engaging in a particular antisocial behavior. The next level on the force scale is voice commands, which I define as telling. The last step was asking, now we moved on to telling. If asking doesn't work, the police officers will then give a lawful command that, if not followed, typically has immediate consequences, either further moving down the scale of force or moving towards a formal arrest of the individual. So asking and then telling, much the same way that parents would work on a scale talking to a child, asking and then telling. But again, the goal is to use the lowest level of force possible. The next level is firm grips, whether that is with the officer's physical hands or with handcuffs. Basically, the goal of this scale, level of scale of force, is to restrict movement of the individual in a way that provides them safety and provides the officer safety. It also lets the officer further assess the situation while everyone is being maintained. Their safety is being maintained. If the firm grips are not working or are not able to be applied, we then have pain compliance, which is typically in the form of arm locks. Police officers are trained in more forms of hand-to-hand combat now. Common types of martial arts that are implemented are judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, types of fighting that teach both holds, ways to restrain an opponent or a suspect in this case, but also teaching striking. But as far as pain compliance, we're talking about basically arm holds, putting a firm grip with the combination of pain inflicted on a joint or a bone to try to have the suspect comply with what were potentially the voice commands that had already been issued before, or the other lawful commands being issued. After pain compliance, if that is not a viable solution, we then have impact devices and techniques. The main type of impact device that is used by police officers now are retractable metal wands. You may have seen those batons that retract. They are used as a very effective impact device. They're very hard. They're also used to break car windows if officers have to do that to get to a suspect or to an attempt to rescue someone from a emergency situation. So they're not just used for beating up suspects. Impact devices and the techniques are some of the strikes that are learned in the martial arts, punches and kicks. Again, they're only supposed to be used in a level equal to, or at least in comparison to, what force is being presented to the officers. We've seen a lot of videos in the past of negatively perceived officer-civilian interactions when the tape is basically just the police officer beating a suspect. So the officers have to be, as they go up the scale of force or down the scale of force to more serious levels of force, the officers have to be aware of the consequences of their actions on the individual, and also the potential consequences on them for using too much force. The last level of force is deadly force. Typically, we would place tasers and electronic devices sort of in between impact devices and deadly force because they're seen as a less lethal method of force, but they can have negative interactions with people's particular biology. If somebody has a pacemaker, or if someone has a pre-existing heart condition, having electric shock, especially in the chest or torso area, can be very impactful. But mainly when we talk about deadly force, we're referring to officer-involved shootings. And it's very important to note that officers are not trained to shoot to wound. Shooting to wound is a very difficult concept to engage in, typically only seen in films. The ability to shoot someone with a semi-automatic pistol from 10 feet away in a particular part of the body is very difficult, which is why police are taught to shoot center mass, that means in the torso, and they are taught to shoot until the threat is neutralized. That usually means emptying their typically 15-round clip before reloading their weapon and assessing the situation. Additionally, the ammunition that police use are specifically engineered to inflict maximum damage on the person shot, while at the same time breaking up within that suspect to not have the issue of having a through and through that would potentially put community members behind a suspect in jeopardy. The case that established what rules dictate when a police officer can and can't engage in deadly force was a Supreme Court case from 1985 known as Tennessee versus Garner. The Tennessee versus Garner case, often establishing what we call the fleeing felon rule, re-examined the conditions under which a police officer can invoke deadly force. And remember, 1985 is in the height of the crime control era of the Supreme Court, so that it's interesting that a case would come down basically limiting police's authority to use deadly force during such a conservative court era. The circumstances of the case were that Gardner broke into a house, stole a purse out of the house. He was exiting the backyard, climbing over a fence, when the police encountered him. The police officers responding shot him from behind, killing Gardner. It was later found that the purse contained $10. The Supreme Court ruled that the old interpretation of the fleeing felon rule, that police officers could shoot any suspect that they believed to be guilty of a felony or had committed a felony, they could invoke deadly force. They could basically shoot them if they were fleeing. The Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, also potentially a violation of the Fourth Amendment for illegal seizure of a person, and established that for the police officers to invoke deadly force, there has to be an immediate and substantial risk for the suspect committing a deadly act or a very violent act around them. So they have to be an immediate threat either to the other officers or to other civilians around them. Then the police officers can use deadly force. So this defensive life standard. They have to be trying to preserve the life of someone else when they are invoking deadly force. So if someone is coming at the police officers with a knife or has a gun, those things would satisfy that requirement for a presentation of threat, resulting in the ability to invoke deadly force. There are several issues associated with police use of force. As I said, excessive force is defined as force that was more than what was needed in a situation, but it was invoked to achieve a police objective. There was something that the police were trying to do that was lawful, that was within their charge, and the force could have been less, but given the circumstances, given that the decision had to be made in the immediate, there was there are grounds, either through precedent or through the reviewer's interpretation of the events, there were grounds to use the level of force that was used. It wasn't malicious, and there was no intent to commit a crime. Overall, in terms of rates of force used, we see force used in about 1 to 1.6% of encounters with the police. Remember, a lot of the encounters that police have with civilians aren't for a criminal issue. They're for a service issue, asking questions, providing advice. Even in the situation where the police could arrest someone, they're only doing so in about half the time. So it's that sort of half the time where they could arrest someone where we're seeing those uses of force take place. From the uses of force that we see, about a third are found to be excessive. Again, not brutality, but excessive. That rates out to about 650 across the country per day in terms of police uses of force. We are more aware of them taking place now with our 24-hour news cycle, with our ability to mine news stories from all over the country. So it might seem like police are engaging in higher levels of uses of force, but really the levels of use of force overall have been going down with our increased education, increased continuing training throughout the course of a police officer's career, and by trying to hire better qualified officers. We're actually seeing those uses of force rates go down, but at the same time, the high-profile negative events are receiving more media coverage, both in the news media and also in social media. So about, if you take the 1 to 1.6%, we'll say 1.2% is a median. About a third of those are found to be excessive. So that's roughly 0.4% of encounters with the police. And from that, a smaller percentage are actually determined to be police brutality. So we're looking at, between 0.2 to less than 0.1% of encounters with the police actually result in a formal charge or complaint of police brutality from the reviewers. There are more instances of police brutality reported by the community, but oftentimes those reports, when investigated, are found to be baseless, which is why police officers really enjoy having those body cameras. They do two things. They hold the bad officers more accountable for their actions, and they also let the good officers have a firm, they have evidence to show that what they did, if they are facing a false claim by a community member, what they did was actually lawful. When we look at situational use of force, the numbers are higher. When we look at situations where the police officers are engaging a known or suspected criminal, uses of force go up. That is sort of to be expected. People that have committed crimes are oftentimes, they're definitely going to be more likely to resist an arrest than someone that hasn't committed a crime. Additionally, the police are going to be in a more heightened mode when they are facing a potential known criminal threat. Also, the response of the suspect when we're talking about an arrest situation is going to play heavily into what levels of force are actually used. If they are resisting the lawful commands, they're resisting being placed in handcuffs, it's going to be much more likely that they're going to have force used upon them during the arrest process. As we've discussed in the past, officers are human. Officers perception of the world, the actions they take, their decision-making process is influenced by who they are. It's influenced by how their race interacts with American society. It's impacted how their cultural norms are interpreted by American society. Whether that's a minority opinion, a majority opinion, those experiences impact the decisions that officers make. It impacts their opinions that they have about use of force, how it should be used, when it should be used. It also impacts their actions, how they decide to use force. Other things impacting that too are educational level, what sort of other de-escalation skills the officers have. There's, just a whole myriad of effects that play into this process about when officers use force and what force they actually use. Another historical issue that has come up with police officers using force is the implementation of canine officers, which is probably on the impact device level. High percentage minority communities and cultures have in the past, in the fairly recent past, the last 50, 60 years, have had many negative encounters with canine officers. Canine officers were used in a brutality fashion against civil rights protesters in the 1960s. They were also used fairly frequently with the militarization of police during the 1980s and 1990s. So certain communities, certain cities have differential levels of negative perception of canine officers. They can be very effective tools going into places that would be extremely dangerous for a human officer to go into, but their use has to be tempered within the context of the society and the culture where the officers are going to be implemented. There are some troubling issues with frequency of arrest and that level of force being used when we break it down by race. Particularly when we look at arrest rates for African Americans in this country. And we've discussed some of the discrepancies in the past with regards to arrest rates, particularly with drug arrest rates. We're just going to look at that again here now. Overall, in the arrest population, African Americans make up 28% of all arrests, but only 12% of the United States population in 2007. I mean, we've seen similar numbers when that has been looked at in the time since then. There are some situational factors that play into that, like we talked about what drives officers to use force in particular situations. We have seen over the last 80 to 100 years a concentration of non-white community members in high poverty census tracts. Those areas, for systematic reasons that we've talked about in the past, create environments that lend themselves towards high crime areas. That makes it more likely that the police are going to be engaging in activities in those areas, and it also makes it more likely that community members are then going to encounter the police. Because of that, because of those systematic factors, the situational factors can oftentimes be slanted more towards the police officers engaging in an arrest. You're going to see more people out on the street at night having to walk to take public transit, or if they don't have cars. You're going to see more criminal activity in the streets, which is going to then jade the police officers' opinions about that area. So then they start to see things that maybe aren't happening, or they start to interpret actions of community members in a way that is not what's intended by those members, sort of making them look like they're committing crime, and they're thereby increasing the likelihood of having an arrest situation result from a police-citizen encounter. Additionally, we've seen a light way of calling it would be a provocative standard operating procedure, when we look at the context of zero tolerance policing being implemented in New York City. The short of what happened is that the police officers were sent to enforce all types of crime, but the areas in which they were doing this were almost across the board those high non-white impoverished census tracts, areas of the city that have seen poverty and blight. This is just another type of persecution of those communities. You know, you can find crime anywhere you want to look for it. So if you only go to non-white impoverished areas, you're going to find crime happening there. If you go to the affluent, higher percentage white resident census tracts in New York City, you're going to find crime there, as we saw in the video. You see people jaywalking, engaging in other types of antisocial behavior that would be heavily policed in other parts of the city. The civilians there were, you know, questioning the legitimacy of people trying to enforce those crimes in their area. Additionally, the manner in which the war on drugs has been fought has contributed to this problem. African Americans make up over a third of drug arrests in this country. And we have seen that there is no difference in drug use rates and drug dealing rates among racial groups. It's a activity in terms of drug use, drug sale behaviors that are engaged in by really all racial, ethnic, and cultural groups, to some degree at least. The demand for drugs is there to some degree in just about every cultural ethnic group, and because of that, there is a subset within that population that is willing to provide those illicit services. So again, the targeted arrest and persecution by prosecution of African American citizens is even more problematic when you look specifically at drug arrests. Additionally, this process has been going on for so long, the war on drugs, the war being fought in the public sphere, that perception eventually becomes reality. If these are the only types of criminals that are shown on the news, in the papers, in the police blotter reports, then eventually people start to form their own opinions and perceptions of what a criminal is. Then when they see someone that looks like that perception, they are more likely to assume that they are a criminal themselves. So the perception becomes reality, and it further persecutes, sort of at a societal, social level, persecutes this subset of the population. Additionally, so we've seen in the past issues with DWB, driving while black or brown, and how those interactions have more negative consequences for minority community members. It's the same way with uses of force. In most areas, any community member is as likely as another member to be stopped by the police. It's then, once that initial encounter has happened, what's likely to occur. For white community members, they're less likely to be arrested, less likely to have force used upon them, less likely to go up that scale of use of force. For non-white community members, it's the opposite. Because of the ingrained societal perception, because of these persecutory policies that have been implemented, those community members that interact with the police have a higher likelihood of being arrested, have a higher likelihood of having force used upon them. And it creates a situation where there is a large gap in between what type of experience these different community members have with the police. So it's important to remember um, and look at why the force is being used, how it's being used, and who it's being used on, to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of police activities or the effectiveness of a new policy for the police force. Make sure to fully read Chapter 10, contextualizing the important facts that we discussed here in this lecture with the report produced by the authors of the text.